This is Climate Watch. I'm Zhao Ying. Welcome to the show. The Trump administration has announced its intention to withdraw from a landmark climate treaty along with 65 other international bodies. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, is the foundational UN treaty for global climate action. Established in 1992, it brings together almost every country in the world. And now the U.S. could potentially become the first nation ever to leave it. Among other organizations the U.S. plans to exit is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, the UN body seen as the global authority on climate science. The White House claims these bodies promote radical climate policies, global governance, and ideological programs that conflict with U.S. sovereignty and economic strength. All of this comes just weeks before the U.S. is set to officially depart the Paris Agreement for a second time on January 27th. What happens next when one of the world's largest emitters retreats from coordinated action? How will the rest of the world adapt? And when climate issues are framed as part of an ideological battle rather than a scientific one, what does that mean for the future of our planet? Joining us now is Daniel Kreeger, the Executive Director and co-founder of the Association on Climate Change Officers. Hi, Daniel. It's great to have you on our show.
Hey there. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, the U.S., especially the Trump administration, has already slashed its involvement in multilateral climate efforts, most notably by withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. Then how do you see the latest decision to pull out of the UNFCCC, the IPCC, and dozens of other bodies? How are things different this time?
I don't want to diminish the significance of this because it's very significant, but it's also expected to some degree based on what we know of his first term and what we've seen him doing with this second term in office. It's significant because the U.S. is now not only not going to be a player in these conversations, but also does not have the benefit of hearing and understanding. And it's a two-way conversation. So while I fully expected U.S. participation in these various regimes to be little or none, this is the formal declaration that it's going to be, but it also is not permanent because he is not president of the United States forever. And the ruling party or the leading party that was elected in office changes in cycles. And so I wouldn't say to the rest of the world that means we're gone permanently, but it does mean that the U.S. no longer has a seat at the table.
Okay, so maybe this is not permanent, but the UNFCCC is like the foundational treaty. It is actually the parent treaty for Paris Agreement. So if the U.S. leaves the UNFCCC, does it effectively burn the bridge for any future administration that might want to rejoin Paris Agreement or participate in future climate agreements?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not clear why a subsequent president wouldn't be able to rejoin the UNFCCC. That said, there's consequences in terms of the relationships and the credibility and the trust of countries working together with an entity that is either not consistently participating or that may be viewed as having counter interests or not working in good faith. And certainly that would be a consideration coming back. But I think it was a consideration, frankly, during the Biden administration when Biden and his team showed up and said, no, we're serious, we're back. I think there was a certain grain of salt on it already because the history of U.S. participation in these bodies had been very volatile, if you will, or inconsistent, going back multiple decades, depending upon which political party was in leadership. I think you could also argue that there have been other countries that have had some volatility in their participation in these efforts over the years as well.
The UNFCCC was ratified by the Senate with unanimous consent in 1992. And Many legal scholars would argue that a president cannot unilaterally withdraw from a Senate ratified treaty. So is that a solid argument? And could the Congress or the courts actually stop or reverse this withdrawal?
Well, it certainly is an argument that is going to be pursued. You're exactly right that in the U.S. legal system and the Constitution, the way it established roles and responsibilities for the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary, the three branches of government, that the Senate does need to ratify treaties. Um, that said, the executive branch, whether it's pulling out of a treaty or just choosing not to participate in it, how much of a, I think you can come back to the argument, does it matter if we're party to the treaty if we're not involved in any conversations whatsoever by
Mhm.
it? I think the net effect is the same, right? And so I think at some point or another, yes, there will be fights over the legality of it in the US, and I think you may see that manifest itself in the court system to some degree. But I think at the end of the day, even if there was an argument that prevailed that President Trump cannot pull out of this treaty for that reason, the administration is still not at the table with other countries working constructively on these issues. So I don't think that there's an enormous amount there right now.
Okay, but if a future administration wants to get re-involved in such kind of conversation, but if the withdrawal goes ahead, what would they have to do to rejoin?
I don't think that there's any language in the UNFCCC that precludes a country from rejoining if they had left it. I think at that point is you sign on, whatever you have to do as a country to sign on happens. So in our case, in the United States, it gets ratified by the Senate. We're back at the table from a legal construct. But from a trust construct, the international relationships, the partnership, the confidence that we are a partner working in good faith with other countries to work on this challenge, there's an enormous amount of work that has to be done. Because as of right now, I don't see how other countries could look at the United States and say this is a serious partner at the federal level. That said, what we did see in the past was when President Trump announced his intended withdrawal from the Paris Agreement during the previous term, immediately we saw a very strong reaction from industry with Fortune 500 CEOs making bold proclamations, cities and states within the United States. You had the compact of mayors, you had the Mayor's Climate Caucus, you had the U.S. Climate Alliance of governors, started by three governors in particular, the governors of Washington, Jay Inslee, governor of California, Jerry Brown, and governor of New York, Governor Cuomo. You had three states that started and said, we stand in solidarity with the rest of the world, and other states signed on, and ultimately got to a point where more than half of American states, representing an enormous amount of the US GDP, an enormous amount of the population, had signed on and said, we stand in solidarity with the rest of the world, and we're continuing to work in good faith towards these objectives as well as in collaboration with. This time around, there's less of that going on. And there's certainly a lot less of this. We stand with the world in really bold public facing statements because there's been a sort of fear of this administration and or retaliation. And so we're not seeing that as much. And that actually, I think, is very disheartening.
Okay, and also in terms of the real impact, emissions monitoring and transparency are core UNFCCC obligations. So if the US stops official reporting, how serious is the gap for global stock takes and scientific assessments?
Yeah, so there is in the UNFCCC framework, and you're spot on. In the original treaty, there's a requirement that countries update their emissions. If I recall correctly, between the UNFCCC and then the Paris Agreement amendment to it, it's every 5 years. So you may see an impact here on one of the reporting timeframes, or maybe even two. Um, and that's a factor because the US is the second largest current uh, emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. So certainly, if you're looking at this holistically, that would be one piece of information that's important. Quite frankly, there are other ways to measure the emissions geographically. I mean, satellite data will give us really good context and understanding. We can measure the atmosphere. And again, I don't want to diminish the significance of that because this is the second largest emitter of GHGs in the world. This is the one of the two most significant economies in the world. The ripple effects of this are very, very significant. From a policymaking standpoint, from an international negotiations, working with common sets of data, there's obviously going to be a pretty substantial gap.
Yeah, and you mentioned the ripple effect. What do you mean by that? Because symbolically, the U.S. would be the first and only country ever to leave this UNFCCC. So, what message might that send to other countries?
Well, that in and of itself is one message, right? Is you've got almost every country on planet Earth has come together and said, we have diagnosed that there is a problem that affects all of us. That's the UNFCCC. And as part of that, we are going to share information and figure out how to address this problem. Now, we may come to disagreements on how to address it, who deserves what, who's going to do what. Okay, that's all part of the devil is in the details. But now you've got an entity that is one of the most significant influences geopolitically and economically on planet Earth, right? The United States has a massive impact. Its foreign policy has a massive impact. Its economy has a massive impact. It is a massive customer to a substantial amount of the gross domestic product of countries like China. And, there's a question now as to, okay, well, what does that look like in terms of not just the policy side of the international framework of countries working together, but the pragmatic realities of countries doing business with each other, economies that are reacting to one another, and that obviously is substantial impact of this.
Okay, and let's look at the IPCC because unlike the UNFCCC, there's no formal way to withdraw from the IPCC because it's a scientific body that's open to all UN and WMO member governments. But the US has already effectively disengaged as missing key plenary sessions, cutting funding, and even blocking official travel for its scientists. So, what does the US government's absence mean for the IPCC, especially as it works on
Well,
its seventh assessment report, right?
yeah, and then that's a great question. I think I see a couple of really clear impacts here. One to the IPCC process and the kinds of materials and reports that it generates to inform international level discussions and national level policymaking. But the other impact I see is on the US side and harmful to us here in America. So, on one side, having a US government that provided support and mandate and resources to support the IPCC meant that you've got a better IPCC in the end, right? We want the world's leading scientists participating in this process, and if we take one of the biggest centers of research on the planet off the table, then the outcome to the IPCC itself is negative, right? That certainly is harmful. On the other side, I would argue that the whole premise of the IPCC was to give actionable information to the international community. One, to inform their participation in the UNFCCC negotiations, and two, so that the countries could begin to plan and execute its policy and strategies in dealing with climate change. And now we no longer have as good a benefit of what comes out of that. Um, yeah, the third part is, I mentioned the resources going back to the IPCC scientists. I served as a reviewer on behalf of the US government team for one of the chapters during one of the earlier iterations of the IPCC report. It wasn't just government employees, but the government served as an organizer of bringing forward experts from a variety of perspectives. Mine was not, I was not there as a science expert, but as someone who had insight on the workforce of climate change professionals
Mhm.
and what kinds of information it needs. And now that insight no longer goes, that commentary no longer goes into the IPCC review process. That's also a missed opportunity for both sides.
Okay. Well, the Trump administration is also leaving more than a dozen of other climate, energy, biodiversity bodies. I mean, does this suggest the US no longer believes it can win arguments on global stage, so instead it chooses to flip the table and walk away?
No, I don't think that's, I don't, I actually, I wouldn't frame it that way at all.
Hmm.
I don't think that this administration was out there trying to convince the rest of the world of its stance on climate change. And then when they couldn't do so, said, we're walking away. I think it just decided that this was not, it either didn't believe it, didn't think it was important, or just decided, you know what, we're not going to participate in this process because it's the process itself is contrary to our priorities and interests. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I don't think this was a, we can't convince you, so we're not participating. I don't think that's what was in play here.
Okay, but actually, we see that often in climate negotiations, the US has often acted like a kind of brakeman, like it's using its influence to water down language on fossil fuel phase outs, on finance or liability. So, in that sense, could US withdrawal actually be a case of addition by subtraction? Like, is it possible for the rest of the world that they can now move faster without the US in the room?
Well, let me start with the last part of that question. You may be able to go faster, but you will not be able to go further
Hmm.
if you take the largest economies and contributors of emissions out of the process. Let's be very clear because that means, I mean, we've got a global issue here. The atmosphere does not care who is at the table. The gases are in the atmosphere or they are not.
Hmm.
And if the second largest polluter in the world currently and historically largest is not at the table working on this, that's a problem. But I want to be very careful here in describing any country's role in this as being obstructionist because there's a long list of countries who have either played that a role that could be argued was obstructionist or who came to the table with a policy and mandate to tackle this from a different perspective. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what that looks like. Uh, at the history and the core of the UNFCCC debates is an argument between the countries who are most harmed by climate change from a economic and or population perspective versus the countries who are perceived to have caused it and saying, well, you caused it. We don't contribute to it nearly as much as you do. You should be paying for the damages. That has been a core sticking issue every year in the negotiations, those who caused it versus those who are harmed by it. I'm oversimplifying in that description, but that is absolutely a big issue. I also remember in 2009 when I was in Copenhagen when negotiations amongst the parties were advancing very dramatically. You will remember at that point in time that President Obama was leading the way for the United States. You had a Democratic House, a Democratic Congress. There was a mandate to advance things, and um, dozens of countries led by China stormed out of the negotiations and brought a screaming halt to progress. So there's a long history here of different countries not contributing as effectively to this process and or having their own perceptions on what they needed through this process to see it forward. So we have to be very careful in labeling obstruction versus understanding the complexity of there's roughly 200 countries involved in this process, and not everyone is made equal. Not everyone has the same amount of resources available to deal with it. Not everyone has the same level of accountability in having caused it. And we have to figure out how to bring everyone together and find a path forward. And that's very complicated.
Okay, but I mean, if you look at the decarbonization efforts today compared with, say, back in 2009, some would say that today is less about treaties and more about technology, markets, and national policy. So does that mean that the U.S. withdrawal may be less consequential than it might have been a decade or 2 decades ago?
Oh, that I would agree with that statement emphatically. If any major economy pulled out of this process before it really had gotten any sort of momentum, it would be devastating for sure. At the time, the largest economy in the world said, "We want nothing to do with this," and then there were no resources to catalyze that. That would be devastating. But let's look at where we are today. We have an enormous amount of research and development and technology that has arrived already that is gaining traction. And to some degree, I think you could argue that in some of these arenas, uh, policy is really not going to matter. It's traction and the evolution of the technology, and consumers are going to drive certain things. Um, that's not all of it. So let's be clear, there's an enormous amount of overhaul of infrastructure around the world that needs to take place. To be clear, you know, the most amount of coal being burnt around planet Earth and the new coal being developed is not in the United States. So we need to solve that problem as much elsewhere as here. But on the flip side, look at the emergence of solar and wind, and battery technologies, and all of these things are coming along. They could come along faster. They would come along faster with really good policy and devotion of national resources and coordination amongst governments, better coordination. All of these things would make it better, but it's not going away either. And these things do make a difference. It's just we need policy too.
Yeah, and we're seeing major US tech and auto companies, they continue to set their own net zero targets regardless of what happens in Washington. So can the private sector carry the US climate contribution on its own, in your opinion?
I wouldn't say on its own, but it is going to continue doing so. And it is important that every sector of the economy whether it's public sector, private sector, various manufacturing and economic sectors, critical infrastructure sectors, everybody needs to be asking the question, how does climate change affect us? And what do we need to do in response? And and yes, we need to reduce emissions. We also need to have a very clear understanding. Climate change is already here. We are already feeling the teeth of this in a lot of places. So it's not just that we have to reduce emissions, that we have already committed to a transformation of what this world is going to look like and already looks like today. So we also, in addition to the reduction of emissions, we need to be more adaptive and more resilient at national levels, at subnational levels, at industry levels. And we've gotten some tastes of that. I mean, COVID gave us a little bit of a field test here on resilience in supply chains in key industries, in public health. And, candidly, globally, we weren't ready for it.
Okay. Well, people say that if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. Do you worry that US companies would be on the menu because by stepping away from global climate institutions, the US kind of loses ability to negotiate or to shape the global carbon standards? And does that turn US companies into the rule takers that are forced to comply with standards set by other countries?
Yeah, it's interesting. How do you evaluate what a US company is today in the context of true multinational companies? If you're a US based company with a manufacturing set of operations in Europe, regardless of whether you're US or not, those manufacturing operations are subject to whatever regulatory regimes are taking place in the EU, right? So to some degree, I don't worry so much about, are you at the table or are you on the menu? That said, again, the kinds of overhaul that need to take place in our economy, in infrastructure, no one sector can handle on its own. So oftentimes I'll hear companies put really ambitious net zero or aggressive GHG reduction goals, but when they analyze the practicality of achieving that, they'll say there's certain things that are outside of our fence line or control that we need to see happen, in order for us to achieve that. And one of them, for example, would be a cleaner grid. And that company, if you're talking about a manufacturer, uh, doesn't have the ability to change the grid, right? The electric power utility needs to do that. And so part of that is we can't indefinitely just buy our way to net zero with offsets, with carbon offsets and car and emissions allowances and renewable energy credits. So, in the end, yes, you're going to see the private sector doing things in response to consumers, in response to their customers, that B2B driven things where we see supply chain mandates going on. That's going to continue onward. Um, but there's only so far you can go as well if you're not looking holistically at this, and that holistically requires investments in policy making.
Well, you said earlier that the US is walking away from all these climate agreements because the administration feels they no longer serve the US interests. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio has described these international bodies as part of a globalist project advancing DEI, gender equality, and climate orthodoxy that are tied to what he called the discredited end of history thesis. How accurate is this characterization, and what does it reveal about the administration's broader motivations for withdrawal?
Yeah, this is interesting. 5 years ago, during Trump's first administration, I don't remember seeing all of these things tied in the same way that we see them now. And this is I've feared for a long time that positioning dealing with climate change with other social issues that are not directly relevant to it was going to create a problem, which is that the climate change is its own thing, and the impacts of climate change are tangible, they're measurable, they clearly affect social issues, and they clearly affect people, and they affect people in a disproportionate way. To put that into a conversation, for example, on gender equity, to me, they're two completely different things. And now, if you have somebody who, while I may personally feel one way or another, that attaches these two issues together and cannot separate them, now we've actually created a real obstruction to tackling something that we just simply cannot have happen. But that's what's happened. I do believe at the heart, when you asked me earlier, is the United States pulling out of these things because it can't convince the rest of the world to see it the United States way? No, I don't think that's what's happening. I think what's happened is dealing with climate change has been categorized as something akin to being in the category of woke. And I'm saying this as I have I'm doing the quote gesture with my hands right now, and it's not. Being in a wildfire and dealing with wildfires is not woke. Dealing with flooding is not woke. Dealing with air quality issues is not woke. Being able to generate the food that you need to produce for people because things are not growing because the climate is changing is not woke. And yet, all of these things now have been lumped into a set of other issues that they just can't afford to be tied to. And it's not to say that I don't think those other issues are important. They need to be dealt with in and of themselves separately. And I think that we are now, we're dealing with the consequences of this all being lumped together.
But do you think the US public buy this, that this is framed as part of a broader ideological battle? Because I think if that's the case, it would be very dangerous if this generation or future generations, they would see it this way.
I agree. I mean, this is climate, it's interesting. I remember a time when people used to ask me the question, do you believe climate change is real? This is not a belief thing.
Mm-hmm.
This is there. We've got evidence. It's measurable. We've known about the greenhouse effect since the mid 1850s, before there were computers. We could create and test this, right? So if we've known for 170 years how to measure the greenhouse effect, then there's nothing ideological about that. Now, Where we can get into ideological considerations is the how to deal with it. And that, I think there's reasonable arguments. Who should pay for what? Who should do what? Who's responsible for what? Okay, those are appropriate conversations that are frankly going to be influenced by the ideology. But the underlying science of it, do we have ideology on somebody being diagnosed with cancer? You either have cancer or you don't. And you either have a genetic marker for Alzheimer's or you don't. These are things that are not subjective, they're not ideological, they're not argument, but we can have an argument about how to treat it and what's appropriate. And that's the distinction that used to be the case. And now what's happened is now we've thrown away the diagnosis, the agreement on the diagnosis, and we've said that the diagnosis itself was ideological. That is extraordinarily dangerous. It's very scary.
Well, Daniel Kreeger, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that wraps up this edition of Climate Watch. You can find more episodes on your favorite podcast platforms. Just search for Climate Watch and hit subscribe. Don't forget to leave us a quick review or share it with a friend. You can also email us at radio@cgtn.com with your questions or feedback. And stay updated on the latest climate stories with our Substack newsletter, Climate Choices. I'm Zhao Ying. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.